From WRAL News, this is Focal Point.
Ask Dwight McLean how many of his relatives have gone to jail or prison, and here's what he'll tell you.
Almost all of them. It'd be easier for me to name the people who didn't than the people who have.
Now Dwight is in prison too.
The justice system is overwhelmed with these kids.
Why do so many young black men end up here?
They've lacked the family guidance in their developing years.
There seem to be solutions.
It's not something that we can't do. It's something we have to have the will to do.
But some say a generation of young black men has already been lost in a cycle of poverty, family instability, and crime.
They're trapped. They are trapped.
Black males make up only about 10% of North Carolina's population, but account for nearly 60% of our state's prison population. 60%. Why? Why do so many of those men end up behind bars? The story of one young man may hold some clues. Dwight McLean is serving a life sentence for murder. He's 19 years old.
That's more than 50 years that he's going to serve in prison. He's never going to get out.
In November of 2002, McLean and his cousin robbed a Raleigh public utility building just as employees were cashing their paychecks. McLean shot and killed one of them, a man named Robert Saez.
We arrested Dwight McLean for the November 1st slaying of Robert Saez.
That's Dwight spitting at TV cameras after his arrest. Police also arrested his uncle Lewis, who worked at the utility center. They say Lewis recruited Dwight to commit the crime. Last October, a jury found McLean guilty of first-degree murder.
The jury had a substantial amount of evidence which indicated that he, in fact, did commit this crime, and I think that their verdict is supported by the evidence.
Gaskins urged the jury to spare McLean's life. In his closing argument, he played a George Strait song called Love Without End, Amen.
Let me tell you a secret about a father's love.
And the point that I was making was that Dwight had not had a positive father-son relationship.
The jury sentenced McLean to life. Gaskins believes their decision was based on the facts of the crime, not McLean's childhood.
All right.
But he says he wanted to send a message that there was a connection between the two.
We see it over and over. I've been doing it for 25 years, and I've seen it so many times I can't count. And if there's a common theme, it's that they don't have a positive family background.
How do you think his upbringing has shaped who he is?
Probably entirely. It's just a real shame that he's found himself in this situation. Had he had available to him the kind of family background that all of us hope to be involved in, it's very unlikely that he'd be in this trouble now.
Next, tracing that trouble to Dwight McLean's troubled life.
Dwight had a better upbringing than we did.
You're watching Focal Point from WRAL News. In-depth coverage you can count on.
Many in the criminal justice system say it's no mystery to them why so many young black men end up in prison. They point to the common threads in the fabric of so many of their lives. Born to single mothers living in poverty, exposure to drugs, crime, and violence, no relationship with their fathers. The next thing you know, they're in trouble at school and then with the law. While each one of these stories is different, you can find those common threads in the life of Dwight McLean.
Code red, single cell 3.
Dwight McLean was only 5 years old when the Wake County Department of Social Services took him and his 5 siblings away from their mother Linda in 1991.
He was done as a result of an incident of domestic violence between Miss McLean and her boyfriend.
DSS had ordered her to keep the boyfriend out of her apartment and away from her children. She violated that order. Reports say the boyfriend beat her and the children and shot up the apartment.
It became clear that the protective plan had been broken, that children were not safe in the home, that they were exposed to domestic violence, and that they needed to be removed and placed, which then happened.
Yes, I had a boyfriend that was always fighting me and everything, and I ended up putting him in jail because he kidnapped me one time and took me in the woods, and he did some horrible things to me, but social service was on my case long before this incident happened.
Yes, it was. A case that now stands in files 1.5 feet high with another 1,300 pages on microfiche. DSS began investigating Linda McLean in 1982. Over the next 3 years, it documented multiple reports of neglect, including leaving her children unattended, living in an apartment without heat or electricity, and sometimes living in no home at all.
But during all this period of time, there was regular contact by a social worker working with the family to correct these issues that had been brought to the agency's attention, which had been substantiated.
In 1983, DSS substantiated a case of inappropriate discipline on one of McLean's daughters.
And I attended to all three of them.
Her mother, who sometimes cared for the children, saw the evidence and reported it to DSS.
About like my fingernail, there was 2 cigarette burns right on her, right back here.
In 1985, when Linda McLean was pregnant with Dwight, DSS took her children and put them in foster care. Thinking conditions had improved, DSS returned them a year later. But in 1987, there was another report of inappropriate discipline. Caseworkers also found the children without basic necessities like proper clothing, toiletries, food, or even utensils to eat it. Reports also show the family frequently moved. In one 3-month period, they lived in 4 different locations. Over the next few years, DSS provided assistance with rent, utilities, and food.
Over the course of a year, I was at that home about over 50 times, almost once a week over the course of a year.
Caseworkers say taking children away from their mother is a last resort. But with no improvement in the situation, Linda McLean refusing to cooperate, and the threat of violence in the home, they say they had little choice. In his trial testimony, this is how Scott Perrell summarized Dwight's family life.
The children float more or less loosely among various relatives, with Linda's living situation a base from which they return and leave. Linda fluctuates between being their mother to almost being a child herself. The family does not seem to be a tight, cohesive unit, but rather a number of loosely changing alliances.
What would you take back? What would you change?
The only thing I think I would change is that, because I would never change the fact that I had my kids, because I wanted my kids when I had them. But I didn't know at the time it would be as hard raising them after I had them.
How old were you when you had your first child?
17.
DSS gave custody of Dwight and his siblings to their grandmother, Carrie, who lives near 4 Oaks.
My grandma said when she first got custody of me, I would always cry a lot and want to go back to my mama's house.
Carrie McLean was already taking care of several other grandchildren.
I don't know how she do it, but she do it.
I didn't hardly ever have to whoop one. Sure didn't. Them children were just as mindful as they could be to me.
But Carrie McLean says that changed as the children got older. She says at 13, Dwight talked back at her for the very first time.
And I haul over and get him a backhand lick. And I get out there and bring some wood in the house. I said, let me hear it again, I'll probably kill you.
Dwight's attendance at school began to suffer.
I really won't focus on my schoolwork like I supposed to have been. I ain't giving any effort, I don't think. Well, I know I did. I could have done better than what I did.
Diane Parker, a social worker at South Johnston High School, tried to help Dwight and his grandmother.
I think he had some anger management problems. There were teachers who were afraid of him.
Dwight was expelled from South Johnston for fighting and sent to South Campus, an alternative school for students with discipline problems.
I was going, coming, stuff like that. I would never just go to school like 2 straight weeks at a time. I just didn't like that school. And I dropped out. I was trying to go, but it just, I ain't like that school.
Diane Parker has seen students like Dwight too many times.
I sit there and I wonder, what else could I have done? Is there something I could have done? Or that I see the school should have done? But we can only sometimes suggest, make recommendations to parents. We can't force them. People have a right to make choices, and sometimes those choices may not be the best.
Parker says a positive male role model in Dwight's life might have made a difference, but his father refused to acknowledge him. They never had any relationship at all.
What do you think he could have done for you had he been there?
He could have done more for me. He could have helped me out. He could have, there's a lot of stuff he could have done, because my grandma, she's a woman. Like, certain stuff she can't help me do, she can't relate to me with, like, he could have had did. I wish he was there for me, but I guess he just didn't want to. He didn't want to take responsibility.
I do think that it is important in terms of a child's self-esteem and in terms of a male child's learning to have successful male role models.
Next, the male role model that was there for Dwight McLean.
An uncle who had a long criminal history.
You're watching watching Focal Point from WRAL News. In-depth coverage you can count on.
When you look at the lives of young black men in prison, you often see lives that lacked positive male role models during childhood. If there are no good choices, a child will often choose whoever is available. In the case of Dwight McLean, that choice was costly. Dwight looked up to his Uncle Lewis.
Yes.
The look on your face tells me that that probably wasn't the best role model for him to choose.
No, no.
Why did he choose him?
I don't know, because one thing, my brother could give Dwight things that I couldn't. Name brand clothes, shoes, let him drive his car with the rims on it, stuff like that.
I just started to like him.
Did you know he had a criminal record?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't matter.
It was my uncle.
The man he looked up to not only recruited him to commit a robbery, but also fingered him as the murderer.
Everything my uncle did for me was try to take care of me and treat me right.
His uncle also had 19 felony convictions between 1983 and 1995, including a murder charge that was reduced to voluntary manslaughter.
That's one of the influences that Dwight was subject to. Not only an uncle who with a long criminal history, but a mother with a long history herself.
How many times have you been arrested?
Maybe twice.
We found 10 arrest warrants for Linda McLean. About half ended up in convictions, one for assault with a deadly weapon. She was also arrested along with several members of her family in connection with nearly 30 break-ins that occurred in Wake County in 1992.
It was basically straightforward, drive up, kick the door in, grab stuff and leave.
While several relatives were convicted in the break-ins, charges against Linda McLean were dropped. How many people do you know in your family that have been to jail at one time or another?
Almost all of them. It'd be easier for me to name the people who didn't than the people who have. It's like, I know my brother, Travis, my brother Micey, my sister Tony went to jail before, my cousin Cherie, my cousin Sharon, my Uncle Lewis, my Uncle Deborah, my Uncle Bruce, my Uncle James.
He said it'd be easier for me to tell you how many have not been.
He right. He right.
Even Dwight's grandmother has been to jail.
He could have easily have not been involved in this crime had he been able to get away from those bad influences, and he wouldn't be where he is now.
Do you think Dwight's upbringing had anything to do with the chance that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, where he is now?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Johnny Gaskin says it took a subpoena to get Dwight's mother to testify at her own son's trial.
Once she testified, she left and never came back.
You being a good mother to Dwight?
Yes.
Some jurors believe Dwight's mother and other relatives share the blame for his fate.
He had no role models to go.
This juror wanted his identity hidden for fear of retribution from the McLean family.
At least from my standpoint, the situation could have been avoided. That if Dwight was raised in a different manner and nurtured in a different manner, that he would not have been there. It's a waste. It's an absolute waste.
It was just a very problematic existence for him. It's not what you'd want for any kid. And what that did to him as far as his ability to reason and anticipate consequences and have good judgment can't be good.
I don't think that there's an excuse for murder. I think sometimes there are explanations of why things happened that do cause jurors to look at more than just the crime, and they should.
Perhaps society should too. Maybe those explanations reveal its failures.
And I represent the state, the people of this state. I deal with things after everyone else has failed. The family has failed, the church has failed, maybe the school system, the community, everybody else has failed when they commit a crime and they come to the courthouse.
This is going to use this as an example, okay?
Next, fixing the failures.
We can't be held accountable for what someone else does. But if we're not doing anything about it, then I think we should be held accountable.
You're watching Focal Point from WRAL News. In-depth coverage you can count on.
To learn more about the issue covered in this episode of Focal Point, visit WRAL.com and click on News. There are many strong and successful black families in our community who do a good job raising their children and whose children go on to do great things. But what about parents who can't or won't provide the caring and nurturing environment a child needs to succeed? That's where the community comes in. And many say it's the people in the community who are the keys to keeping young black men out of prison. A black male child enters the world. Will he end up in prison like Dwight McLean?
Please help me welcome Dr. Jim Johnson.
Or will he be a distinguished professor like James Johnson? Johnson says it's largely a matter of economics. He teaches management sociology and public policy at UNC's Keenan Flagler Business School. He says the manufacturing jobs that helped many black communities thrive began disappearing in the 1970s. More black kids started growing up in concentrated areas of unemployment, poverty, drugs, and crime.
Rarely do these kids see mainstream role models that work every day because these communities are bereft of the kinds of jobs that used to exist.
Johnson is an expert witness in the murder trials of young black men from communities just like those.
The defendant, having been found guilty by...
He testified in the trial of Daniel Green, who murdered Michael Jordan's father in 1993.
In his case, and in just about every one of the 40 cases that I've done, there's a high degree of family instability.
No father in the picture, exposure to violence and crime, and a family that's always moving.
So you have no anchoring whatsoever. You've developed no basis in the community, no connections with institutions. You have no significant role models.
In trials, Johnson charts a defendant's life with smiling faces symbolizing the good and frowning faces the bad. The chart of Daniel Green's life shows mostly frowning faces.
As prosecutors always say, well, you're given an excuse for murder. I don't study excuses. What I try to do is understand the way society operates and the nature of inequality in society.
Johnson believes there's a link between a child's exposure to neglect, abuse, and violence and the odds of that child committing a violent crime as a teenager or adult.
Again, it's not an excuse for murder, but it's an understanding the context in which these kinds of events do occur. And you doing what?
He says creating a more positive context means connecting those young black men to people and institutions that can show them another way of life. He calls it bridging social capital. The capital can be organizations like the church, the YMCA, and youth clubs.
We have to figure out how do we seed these communities with those kinds of resources or build bridges for these kids to those kinds of resources outside their community. Middle and upper class families buy it. Oh, okay.
Johnson is building bridges through his Durham Scholars Program. It pairs inner-city kids with mentors from the Keenan Flagler Business School and after-school activities.
So you like that stuff?
The goal is to get them high school diplomas and college degrees. The mentors serve as role models now and as connections to the business world later.
If you can build those kind of social capital resources, then the inclination for gangs, the inclination to do drugs, to engage in violence and things of that nature is much less than it is if you let these neighborhoods continue to fester.
Some people been there before.
Keith Gardner sometimes found a valuable social connection in a single person.
Whether it was a teacher, a bus driver, a janitor. My 6th grade teacher said, you know, Keith, you can do it. You can do it. Hang in there. Hang in there. Come over to my house and eat on Sundays. Hang in there.
Gardner grew up an orphan, living with a crack-addicted aunt in a tough neighborhood in the Bronx.
Never knew my father. I knew he was on drugs and in and out of prisons.
Like so many of his peers, Gardner ended up on the streets, involved in drugs and crime. But a longing to escape that life overcame him.
Wanting to make it, wanting to succeed, wanting more out of life, I think is just the determination inside of me that made me want more.
Gardner hopped a Greyhound bus for Raleigh, finished high school, and worked his way through college. One night in Durham, 2 teenagers tried to rob him.
There's about a 16-year-old pointing a gun in my face. Another kid, maybe 14, has a gun in my face. So I turn around, so I have 2 guns facing me, and I'm in the middle.
Gardner ran. The teenagers shot at him, but missed.
I felt like someone let those 2 men down, those 2 gentlemen.
The following week, he applied for a job as a teacher at a youth development center run by the State Department of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention.
It's a job. It's a mission.
Gardner says it was time for him to be the kind of role model those teenagers need.
Had that positive factor in their life, been there and they had that, they probably wouldn't have been here and maybe been at a basketball game or at home. You're going to write a poem of encouragement.
Gardner says ultimately these young men are responsible for the crimes they committed.
But a kid who wasn't taught values or doesn't have any morals, it's hard.
Hard to make the right choices, but Keith Gardner is living proof that they can overcome the odds and succeed.
I think it just takes a person to bring it out and pull it out. Just putting positive factors in these kids' lives will help them.
Over the limit.
The Secretary of Juvenile Justice says those positive factors need to be there long before young men reach his facilities.
I've always believed that the best place to deal with crimes in the high chair, not the electric chair. We have to, as a society, buy into prevention. The early intervention and prevention money spent saves millions of dollars on the deep end.
Go ahead,
This is the deep end, and it'll cost nearly $30,000 a year to keep Dwight McLean in it. That cost could reach nearly $2 million in his lifetime, not counting inflation and future medical care.
We will pay for that young man's life and development and taken care of for the rest of our lives, when all we have to do is to turn around and make a priority of trying to intervene during the early school years.
There's the taxpayer's cost. Then there's the cost of talent lost when so many young black men sit behind bars instead of behind desks.
And I think at the end of the day, our competitiveness in the international marketplace is going to hinge on our ability to solve these problems.
But the biggest cost is not financial. By far, the biggest cost is human. Robert Saez lost his life. His family lost a loving husband and father. That cost cannot be forgotten. In many ways, Dwight McLean lost his life too.
In my head, I just say, I know I'm gonna get out. I know I don't deserve to be in here, so I just don't feel like I'm gonna be in here the rest of my life. It's not, I don't think it's possible. In my head, something just say, I'm gonna get out. I know I'm gonna get out.
I cannot believe that all of these young men that's in the justice system, that's in prison, I do not believe that all of them should be there. And I believe that there is something that could have been done to make their lives more successful. It's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.